Hello and welcome to TelecomTV. We are here at the OPNFV Summit in Berlin in Germany, and the subject of this is a little two-on-one panel discussion is driving innovation in open source. And here with me to discuss it on my right is Prodip, who is a CTO NFV at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and on his right John Healy, General Manager of the SDN Vision at Intel. Gentlemen, good to see you both again.
Good
Welcome.
To see you too.
Let's start with something contentious, and I don't mind who answers this, but do you think it's actually possible to drive innovation through open source anyway?
I think it absolutely is. In fact, we've seen the proof of that through a project like OPNFV. If you consider it's a community, open source in this respect is a project and a community project with multiple entities contributing, multiple developers coming together. So actually in many ways this is the epitome of innovation because it's drawn from multiple different perspectives with a unity of vision about what they're trying to create and trying to do. So you get diverse perspectives, ideas, thoughts, contributions on the path to a longer term unified goal. And so I really think it is a great mechanism for enabling innovation and innovation at scale.
And open source by its very nature is innovative because people who come to open source are actually the developers. Are coming to it because they're interested in working in it. That's what they like to do, and that's where the new ideas come from as you get a diverse community of developers in there. And one of the things which is special about most open source communities, I won't say all, is that the decisions, the development decisions and the decisions on what to include and what to bring forth in a release are technical decisions made by the technical community. Mm-hmm. So we at OPNFV have been very careful that the board and the governance structure is geared such that we do not get involved in technical decisions. We guide the goals of the organization, we provide guidance in terms of requirements and things like that, but all technical decisions are handled by the technical community. So what that does is it does not force a point of view, it does not force things into one direction, and it allows for innovative ideas to come in.
Eminently sensible. That said, and I knew you were going to say what you said in terms of, yes, of course you can innovate in open source, but what about the barriers to getting into that? Are there any still? There were when things started, if we remember, think back a couple of years. Are those barriers lower than they were? Do they still exist?
Barriers exist. I think it's largely in our space, in the space we're trying to do this work, which is for the telecom networks, communication service providers. In that space, open source is largely unfamiliar. There is a certain amount of fear, doubt, uncertainty about it, and it's based on certain myths. It's based on the idea that because it's open and out there, nobody's really controlling it, so to speak, that it's unstable, it's buggy, it's not performant. And the reality is that those myths are myths because when you have a wide set of developers working on a piece of code, there are many different eyes on the code, and the amount of sort of intrinsic auditing you get, you cannot achieve in a particular development organization within a company because people are looking at it from different angles, trying out different things, discovering problems, solving them fast enough, because if I have a problem, there are many different people whom you can turn to solve the problem. So I think those things which we are calling barriers are really myths, but people have to overcome those perceptions and accept what's happening.
And I think in addition to what Prodip said, there's clearly in the communication service provider market, it's been, it's a regulated market. Standardization has been the consistent theme. And there's a sense that open source moves you away from that somewhat and will make it even harder to achieve. So there is a marriage occurring between open standards evolution and open source as a mechanism for innovating and creating scale and solutions. And the two are coexisting, they're progressing together. seen in many of the discussions here at this event, people speak about them synergistically, you know, working through open source projects on a path to standardization of some of the interfaces so that you get a marriage of both worlds. And that helps to overcome some of the concern that this will be difficult to measure, it'll be difficult to monitor, it won't be interoperable, it won't enable compliance, we won't be able to measure and test and show compliance with, you know, regulations and standards. And I think that's evolving, they're both evolving together. So open source just on its own could be more of a barrier than it will be as these efforts progress because of that interplay, because of that marriage.
Absolutely.
Interesting point. I must say I hadn't thought of that. John, much of network transformation, which has been one of the buzzwords in the past couple of years, is predicated on the notion of virtualization. NFV, SDN, etc., cloudification. Let's have a look at what Intel are doing in that space. What are you doing, how are you playing to delivering virtualization performance in a network transformation?
So you're right, it has been one of, I'd probably say, the greatest stimulus behind the move in this direction is virtualization as a set of capabilities. Of course, then implicit in that are a number of pieces, and if you sort of disaggregate what becomes a solution into maybe three broad layers, there's work required down in the base layer, in the platform, NFVI, as we describe it. And that's a combination of work in the technology itself, in the manipulation of the processing, data plane packet processing, the security processing, virtualization support. All of those initiatives and innovations within the platform enable highly performant NFVI. That's really kind of table stakes. You have to have that, but it's step number one. From a virtualization implementation perspective, you have to look to the layer above then, where you have control and manipulation and orchestration, both through the virtual infrastructure management layer and upward into the orchestration layers. And so we've in addition to the work we've done and we continue to do in innovating and developing within the platform, the base level ingredient technologies, we also work very collaboratively with projects outside like Open Daylight and OpenStack to ensure the exposure of those assets up into those next layers of that solution stack. And now as the management and orchestration effort is evolving, or MANO as it's described, we're very actively working there, and and also within OPNFV to help to see how we can harmonize the layers and levels within that'll help to unify how that kind of scheme can be implemented. And they talk about data models and understanding of a virtual network functions requirements and marrying those requirements to the attributes of the underlying platform. That's an exchange of information that allows an orchestration to implement a service in the most optimal way. They're all places where we are, applying ourselves and innovating, because it's not just virtualization as a technology, although that has a roadmap of continuous, improvement and evolution of its own. It's how the remainder of the solution stack evolves around it.
Prodip, what about from Hewlett-Packard Enterprise point of view?
So HPE has been involved in this area right from the beginning. So we've been early adopters of SDN, have been partners with Intel right from the beginning of the NFV journey. And our interest obviously is in building solutions for our customers, building end-to-end systems for our customers which use these technologies. So because of that, we have a little bit of a solution perspective, that is what needs to be done to make the whole thing work. But all of that trickles down to all the areas which John mentioned, that what that means is there's some implications onto what the hardware needs to do. There are implications on what the cloud management needs to do. There are implications on what the orchestration needs to do. And obviously we've heavily invested in working on our server systems, heavily invested in our cloud management systems. Our Healy on OpenStack is based on OpenStack, for example, and take it forward as a product. We have orchestration products which are based on the ETSI specs, and now starting to engage in the open source efforts to help that. So I think in all of these areas we're interested in pretty much all of these areas, because all of them impact the building of the solution.
Thank you. We're looking at driving innovation via and within open source. Looking back again over the past couple of years since NFV burst upon the scene, really, SDN, yes, a given, more or less these days. What about as far as the industry's embrace of the cloud and virtualized machines and so on is concerned? The momentum behind that is great. Is that having a knock-on effect into the concept of open networks and even 5G going forward? Do you think that momentum is going to continue to grow?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the whole premise of IoT systems, and if you look at what's happening in 5G, the only way to address the needs of the Internet of Things and the needs of the 5G architectures and 5G systems people are working on is to go down this path of cloudification and SDN. In fact, I think in the 5G architectures, SDN and NFV are specifically mentioned as techniques to be used within the architecture, to use it natively. And if you talk about IoT, the diversity of things you need to support, the diversity of kinds of traffic you need to support, the scale, all of that is not going to be possible unless you cloudify the networks and have a way of addressing it in a much more distributed fashion. So,
yeah, I totally agree. I see it as it's really a continuum, Martin, to your point, that what has begun within cloud infrastructure, data center and cloud infrastructure, is now finding its way into the remainder of the network. And it starts to create this end-to-end platform that 5G can be built upon, that has all of the scale, all of the agility that's required to enable the whole new wave of services that become possible as we truly move into the Internet of Things with IoT. And it's a continuum, it's a natural continuum. And if anything, I would say the momentum will increase as opposed to will it continue. I think it will increase, particularly as we see the initial deployments start to show fruition, and they'll draw, as a consequence of them, draw more collaborators and more partners in, which really is what starts the flywheel within the industry. And I think that's the phase we're moving into.
For example, one of the core concepts of 5G is this network slicing, the ability to have a virtual slice through the network end to end and offer that as a service to other providers. You can't do that unless you have a cloud-based system, a virtualization layer there to offer that kind of slicing. So it's sort of intrinsic, these kinds of technologies we've been working on. And I think John is right that as the need for those kinds of capabilities emerge in the 5G and IoT networks, it becomes more important for these to progress and meet those requirements.
Let's bring things to an end. We're fairly short of time. We'll wrap in a few minutes. But I just wanted to talk to you about ecosystems. There's a lot of chat about ecosystems and what ecosystems mean, and diversity of ecosystems and so on, within virtualization, within FV, within open source and everything really. And how, as you've just addressed, Prodip, 5G capabilities and so on. How do you think what do we mean by ecosystem diversity within these parameters? Is it simply the fact that there are various bodies that represent various interests and perhaps technologies that attract a certain membership, or is it a wider thing than that? And are you getting concentric ecosystems, one embossed upon the other? Or are we having things like Venn diagrams where the interests of the various ecosystems overlap in various places?
I think it's a bit of both, actually. The overlapping Venn diagram view, I think, is continuing to evolve as what used to be lines of demarcation between even industry verticals are blurring as a consequence of a lot of these technologies. So an ecosystem of partners who had specific domain areas is growing and evolving because of their exposure to the technology and what it enables them to do. You just even think of system integrators and what they can do as a consequence in growing practices and developing them. Large retail chains who are really cloud vendors of form now, changing the demographic even of their employee base to cope with the technologies that become possible that they want to both be able to work with and take advantage of now. It changes what they had as their basic premise for being. So that's a new partnership base and ecosystem that grows around them as an entity, as opposed to being just a retail-based one, just as an example. So that's certainly occurring, but the concentric rings are happening as well. The work we've been doing with Prodip and HP for years now is really in many ways about marriage of ecosystems, the Intel ecosystem and those who are the software, hardware, OS vendors around the underlying architecture and technology, and their ecosystem around solution integration and support around the platform, and the two are very harmonious in being able to work well together. Some are consistent, same vendors in both places, same partners in both places. But to the beginnings of your question about the role they play, it's absolutely essential to the evolution of the market that the ecosystems are both vibrant and growing and interoperable and complementary, because this is a community effort. This is not a, your grandfather's old network industry with 3 or 4 vendors. This is absolutely a collaboration of multiple vendors with significant difference between the role a small player can have versus a very large player, and how in many ways it's lowering barriers to entry and lowering barriers to adoption. But underpinning all of that is vibrancy in the ecosystem and the role we collectively play to assist that and help it to evolve.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, that the open ecosystem and open source in particular levels the playing field a lot about people who can contribute. People coming from small startups or from large companies have, depending on the technical merit of what they're proposing, an equal chance of contributing into this ecosystem. So that lowers barriers, it includes a diversity of thought. But back to your question of overlap, etc. Yes, communities develop to address a certain need. An example, OpenStack. It was developing as a management of the cloud for enterprise applications. But as we were starting NFV and we started to build our requirements, we realized that we needed something like that. And so incorporating some of what OpenStack was doing into the NFV approach is what then naturally has happened as part of the work going on in OPNFV. So the OPNFV releases includes OpenStack. And here is where you have an overlap of communities. Not all of what OpenStack is doing is directly necessary or applicable to NFV, and neither is all of the NFV needs met by OpenStack. So there is an overlap, but it's a synergistic overlap, and it's a healthy overlap, because now you're allowing communities who specialized in doing certain things to do that, but you're using it where it's required in other communities without duplicating that effort. That was a very conscious thing, for example, when we formed OPNFV. That was a very conscious decision we made, that we're not going to develop software here if it's already out there and being developed in some other open source community, unless there's something drastically wrong with it, or it's not viable or whatever. So.
Great. Well, it's really good to get input from people who are really at the sharp end of this. And it's nice to get some clarity on certain things, because there's a lot of fog out there, despite what you said. If you get outside into the wider world, it's not quite as clear cut as you are able to describe it. So Prodip Sen and John Healy, thank you both, as usual, very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks.
Thank you.